Shall we start, Tim?
Yeah, fine.
Okay, so everyone, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our event today. The book I'm introducing today, here it is, has a very unique and poetic name, Cloud Chamber. When I first heard the name, I thought of the many possibilities of what it could mean. It never occurred to me it's actually a very high-tech particle detector used for visualizing the passage of ionizing radiation. Sorry, I copied that from the Wikipedia, so I didn't write it myself. What is even more strange is that this book doesn't just talk about theoretical physics, but mainly focuses on classic Chinese poetry. So how could physics be ever related to poetry or literature or even anything close? Well, my guest today, and the author of the book, Tim Clissold, has the answer. Tim studied physics and theoretical physics at Cambridge University before moving to China and studying Mandarin Chinese. In the early 1990s, he co-founded a business that invested over $400 million in China. His first book, Mr. China, was called an instant classic by Time magazine and was translated into 14 languages. He then co-founded a second business that originated carbon offset in China and currently runs another business involved in dispute resolution. In addition to being a very successful businessman, Tim has a huge passion for Chinese poetry and believes it is one of the most important art forms that define the Chinese civilization. He has talked at many interviews how studying Chinese poetry will help the rest of the world improve their understanding of China. So it's our very honor to have him here today. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, that's really sweet. Thanks so much. So I wanted to start actually by asking everyone to imagine a great room. And this room is in Paris and it's 2014. And gathered there's all sorts of writers and thinkers and politicians and even the president of France. And then eventually a hush comes down on the room and a man stands up at the front and he says, "When I was a young man, I developed a keen interest in French culture, particularly French history, philosophy, literature, and art. By reading modern French history, I've gained a better perspective of the laws governing the political and social evolution of human societies. By reading Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau, I've deepened my understanding of how progress in the mind propels progress in society. By reading Molière, Balzac, and Hugo, I've better appreciated life with all its joys and sorrows. Learning about French culture has also helped me better appreciate both my own culture and the profound nature and rich diversity of human civilization." And the person who uttered those words, if I can get it to work, was Xi Jinping. Now, I can't think of any Western business or political leader that could credibly go to China and try and make those claims. And yet in China, it's not particularly unusual. So if you take Wen Jiabao, when he came to see David Cameron, he brought with him a book by Adam Smith, the famous Scottish economist and philosopher. But he didn't bring The Wealth of Nations, Smith's most famous book, which talks about the invisible hand of the market, allocating resources. Instead, he bought the companion book, which is called The Theory of Moral Sentiment, which talks about the limits that should be set in the market. And he quoted from it at length. And the first thing he asked to do when he came to the UK was to take him to Stratford-upon-Avon to be given a performance of King Lear. This is King Lear being performed in Beijing in 2019. And he said, "I read and reread many Shakespeare's plays as a young man, such as Hamlet, Twelfth Night, Othello, and King Lear. His works are not to be read only once or even 10 times. They must be read up to 100 times to be fully understood." And the Wall Street Journal reported on one's visit, and they thought that he was trying to make a wider point when they said, "Mr. Wen also delivered a political message during the Shakespeare outing, noting that China also has great literary works. By reading about China's history and culture," he said, "you will learn more about my country and the road it has traveled, including how it became strong and powerful and the great sufferings it has gone through. People need to respect history and the fruits of other people's intellect, if they're to build a strong foundation for true friendship. So that might seem like some elaborate propaganda exercise, but I don't think it is, because it's too pervasive. And if you think about the history of China over the last 40 years, it's really been defined by willingness to understand ideas that come outside of its own civilization and experiment with them inside. So, and if they work, you do a bit more of it, and if they don't, you just reject it. So I think it's too pervasive. In fact, I mean, communism itself was actually a Western invention. So that's kind of the leadership. But what about ordinary people? So I think, again, there's a much greater knowledge in China about Western civilization. You know, more than 100 million people studying English. Just before the pandemic, I was in Urumqi station, way in the northwest of China, in Xinjiang. And I went to the station, and in the bookshop there were Chinese versions of Plato's Republic, Kissinger's On China, and biographies of Che Guevara and Churchill, together with all sorts of other ones. When I went to Yan'an in the central province of Shanxi, you know, there was in a bookshop there translated into Chinese, the Anna Karenina, Lady of the Camellias, lots of Dickens works. So I'm not saying that the whole of the Chinese nation is sort of relentlessly studying Oliver Twist and Great Expectations, but there is generally a much, much higher awareness of the basics of the Western civilization in China than there is the other way around. So there's no equivalent knowledge bank really in the West. And I think that means we've got tremendous catch up on our hands. You might well ask, well, you know, why bother? And it's not just from the point of view of what we might learn. There's also a practical aspect to this, because the truth is, you know, the Chinese leadership is right that there is a change undergoing in the world, which hasn't been seen for more than a century. And if you look at any indicator, it doesn't matter what it is, stock market capitalization, trade balances, forex reserves, number of patents being registered, number of tourists traveling, number of students going abroad, there is a very significant shift of both money, power, and self-confidence from West to East. And if in that process, the Chinese know more about us than we know about them, that gives them an advantage they've earned. So I think that we've got a tremendous catch up on our hands, which is really being neglected by our own political leadership. So if we want to get to know China, how do we try and figure out how to do that? So the first thing you need to do is jettison any notion that China's recent progress is entirely or even largely due to Western ideas coming in. There are lots of very basic foundational ideas about the Chinese civilization that are very worthy of study. But to do that, we really need to first consider the language, because that's the tool through which we will be able to understand these underlying ideas. So what I'd like to do is just briefly review the Chinese language before I come on to first the problems of translation of poetry and then some of the poems themselves. So this is just my personal experience that I've sort of gained from living in China for a long time. So there's no sort of basic research behind this, but my feeling is that one of the biggest differences between Chinese and Western civilization is the written word. And that might sound obvious, but it has the fact that it's a character-based written word has tremendous ramifications. So the first one is it gives the ideas permanence. It gives the written word permanence. So what I mean by that is that the words, the meanings of the words can be understood, even though they may be literally millennia in the past. And it gives you a direct contact with what people were thinking and writing and saying thousands of years ago, where there isn't really an equivalent in the West. So this is the page out of the Doomsday Book, which was a census done in roughly 1080. And it's the page that relates to the village that I live in North Yorkshire, and it's not intelligible. So that was written in about 1080. You can't really get any meaning out of that unless you've studied that kind of language for years and years. This, on the other hand, is a scroll written by Huang Tingjian, which is written almost exactly the same time as the Doomsday Book. And if you can read Chinese, you can recognize this instantly. It starts on the right-hand side, 我见黄河水, I can see the waters of the Yellow River. So that gives you a direct connection with the way people were thinking many millennia, centuries and centuries ago, even millennia, in a way that Western language doesn't really give us. The second thing is it provides a mechanism for unifying very large areas, because instructions written at a capital can be understood, say, 500 miles away, where the actual spoken language might be quite different. So it binds together very large areas. And then finally, because it is an amalgamation of meaning and beauty, it gave rise to deep scholarship. And from that, there rose up a class of scholar officials that really formed the backbone of the bureaucracy through which the empire was administered over, again, centuries of time. So these three things, I think, are quite different from our written language. So we come on to the poetry, having looked at the language. That sort of gives us a background, or helps us to set the scene. So what I was really trying to do was to find some genre that can connect us on a human level across such a vast distance in terms of historical experience and civilizational input. And I think that there are certain aspects of Chinese poetry that can kind of bind with anybody, because they express feelings and situations that are common to any human being at any time in any country. So that's why I chose poetry. And poetry in most civilizations starts as an oral tradition, but for reasons that I'll come on to in a minute, that was quite difficult in the Chinese setting. So it was basically in the written word, even as early as the 3rd millennium BC, when there was started to be basically songs written by peasant farmers, like the earth drumming song, as early as the 23rd century BC. That was these poems are eventually codified, allegedly by Confucius himself, into the Book of Odes in the 5th century. But Chinese poetry really came into its into its height in the Tang dynasty, with the dates are there, and then later the Song. So what I'd like to do is read a quick passage out of the book about how I describe this particular genre of Chinese poetry. So I say that Chinese poetry constitutes a vast civilizational asset. It consists of tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of poems running in an unbroken chain from the dawn of civilization 5,000 years ago. For centuries, it's been the function of poetry to express the innermost feelings and beliefs and the deepest, most secret hopes of the beating Chinese heart. It's the ultimate distillation of the meaning and beauty that can be found in Chinese characters. Poetry encapsulates the essence of traditional Chinese culture and belief, the ease with nature, the view that humankind is but one part of a wider universe, that all attempts to dominate non-human nature are futile. The verses show a sense of outrage at injustices, and at the same time, the dangers attendant on protest. Sometimes there's a soft, self-mocking humor that illustrates the effects of passing time on mind and body. We find a yearning to shake off the shackles of convention and breathe the fresh air. At the height of the Tang and the Song, nothing was complete without a poem. No social occasion or ritual, no personal event, no gathering was complete without at least a few lines to capture that fleeting moment. Poetry was everywhere. It still is. In monasteries, on hoardings in town squares, in households, on the streets, in restaurants. It's used today in speeches by politicians or in conversations between friends to illustrate or drive home a point. It entertains, it insults, it persuades, it paints pictures in the air, it inflames loyalty, it soothes the ire of a rebellious youth. Thus, we can use these poems as a window into the innermost world of Chinese thought and imagination. So that's why I wanted to write about the poems. But there's another layer as well, which is I think that the poems describe, the subjects that they touch on, describe issues that we're still struggling with. So, for example, the plight of refugees. So with Du Fu, who is probably China's greatest poet, left 1,500 poems, he lived in a time of social turmoil and war. So from the first lines of his poems, you can picture him as a gaunt and troubled figure, standing on the walls of a ruined city, looking out over a landscape ravaged by war, desperate for news from home. Then we have homelessness. Here we have Lu Yo, who on the 12th of September, 1191, found an old man, blind drunk, living in a filthy shack on the outside of the southern gate of his city. And he wrote, "His roof so broken, the clear skies looks right through, and his rice barrel is generally empty." Sorry, So then we have inequality. Bai Jui, writing in the 800s, describing a desperately poor man who's selling charcoal in the winter just to survive. The clothes on his back, the food in his mouth, so wretched, his coat so thin, yet anxious his fuel might lose value, he longs for icy weather. So this is a man. Here we have not only the plight of a homeless man, but we also have the relationship of supply and demand on price, which is something that wasn't written about in Western literature for centuries afterwards. Tax evasion. The same Bai Jui, who'd failed to keep up to date with his tax, feeling terribly guilty, he's eventually relieved of that guilt when tax inspectors arrive suddenly to seize grain from his barn in lieu of his taxes. "Today at last," he writes, "today at last my heart is at ease as I pay the tithes from my barn." Amazingly, excessive logging. So here we have Liu Zhongyuan in the 11th century, writing, "Axes and hatchets spread across 1,000 hills at the work commissioner's decree. Hack down all trees for posts and rafters." And then he asks at the end of the poem, "Such a disaster, just for the fires in the armory." Then we have substance abuse, admittedly mainly alcoholic. This is by Li Bai, probably the most committed drinker in the whole of Chinese history, who wrote in the 8th century, "Dazed, inert, befuddled, I grope for my solitary pillow. In the end, I don't even know I exist. That then is my greatest joy." And then finally, we have end of life issues. This is Wang Anshi, who was the Chancellor of China during the Song dynasty, a man of immense power and wealth and influence. He's just pondering about the transitory nature of life and reflecting on his own youth as he lay ill in bed and comparing himself to fresh cut flowers. So it's fresh cut flowers and my long lost self, both so soon forgotten. So those are the types of subjects that the poems address. So now what I'd like to do before reading some of the poems later is talk about the problems of translation. So the first thing is that China, as I'm sure lots of you will know, China has many, many homophones, which are distinguished by tone, but that's an extremely difficult thing for most foreigners to be able to master. So lots and lots of homophones. So for example, ao, meaning kind old lady, and ao, meaning a huge legendary sea turtle, completely different. But you may say, well, okay, well, English has got lots of homophones as well, because, you know, if you don't ever, if you say Thai, you don't think you've got a person from Thailand around your neck. But this is taken to the most incredible extreme in Chinese. So this poem is a nonsense, this story, it's a nonsense story written by a professor in the beginning of the last century to illustrate this point. So it's a nonsense story, but it is intelligible. And it tells a story about this man called Gentleman Shi, who lived in a stone house and he was hungry. So he went out to market to buy some food, but all he could find was lions. So he put them in a bag and he came home. But when he came home, he found out the house had been flooded. And when he opened after he cleared up the flood, when he opened the sack, the lions were dead. So they had nothing to eat. And then the last 4 characters is check it. If you don't think it's true, check it out. Okay. So it's a nonsense story, but it is intelligible. But if you translate that into English, every character is pronounced shi. So it's the shi, 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 shi. And that explains to some degree about why most of the Chinese poems are actually a literary tradition rather than originally an oral tradition, because it is very difficult to get meaning into, or at least precise meaning. So I'll take it one step further. So Chinese language has no tense, which changes the verb. So yesterday I eat pickled cabbage for breakfast. Today I eat pickled cabbage for breakfast. Tomorrow I eat pickled cabbage for breakfast. So the point is that when you read the Chinese, you don't know if something has happened or it's about to happen, or most likely it's going on right now underneath your nose without realizing it. Secondly, there are no conjugations, no tenses, as I've mentioned, no articles, no plurals, no gender for individual words, no declension of adjectives by number or gender. So here we have 1 book, 2 book, 3 book, 4. He give he 3 book. She gave he 3 book. So it's very, very difficult to nail down exactly what it can mean. Very often there's no subject to a sentence. So this is 空山不见人. That's a line out of a particular poem. Empty mountain, not see person. But who's not seeing it? There's no real subject in that sentence. And then individual characters have very vague and multiple meanings. So for instance, fu means to caress and to slap. Completely different. You have xu yu, meaning momentarily and at length, which I would say are opposites. Then you have tang, means grey, green, greenish blue, grey, black, silvery white. Quite different in English. And then we have wu, which can mean flat-topped, motionless, bald, empty-headed, and it's also judicial punishment of having one foot cut off. So the point of that is if you've got multiple meanings of individual characters, and this one, helpfully in my dictionary, is pronounced she, and the dictionary just doesn't mean anything. So if you have a concatenation of those types of characters have more than one meaning, you end up having an individual sentence that could have multiple different meanings. So if each of 5 characters has 2 meanings, then the total number of possible meanings in a 5-character sentence is 32, and so on. You can see the rest. So once you get to 3 meanings per character, with 5 characters, you've got more than 200 possible different meanings. But many of the characters have 5 or 6 meanings. So it's very difficult to nail down exactly what a sentence in a Chinese poem means. I'd like to explain that with an illustration. So this is one line out of a poem called Leaving Longbank Village by Li Bai. 五月不可出. So that was translated, that line in that poem was translated into English by 2 absolutely excellent world standard translators who've been doing this for decades. So Kenneth Roxroth's version was, you should not risk the dangerous floods of May, whereas Tony Barnstone said, I've not been able to touch you for 5 months. So that gives you an idea of the different kind of interpretations that can be put onto individual lines and meanings in poems, which of course is excellent news for me, because nobody can ever say that my translations are definitively wrong, because it's just so difficult to actually define the meaning. So that's good news for me. Then you get on to information density, the tremendous density of information within a Chinese character. So this is shi, to salute with a half bow whilst leaning on the horizontal crossbar at the front of a carriage, right? How do you get that into pithy, terse English? To beat a drum with one hand but not sing. Ugh. People who can read Chinese will know that that's not the right character, but I couldn't find the character in any of the word lexicons. And this is my favorite, jiqiu, which is defined in one dictionary as the art of making sieves and fur coats. Where did that come from? So it's very difficult to get the real meaning of the Chinese into English. So you have this very, very vague meaning of individual characters. But the thing that I think is really interesting is that it's then structured in a very, very rigid frame. So this particular genre of Chinese poetry, which has reached its height in the Tang and the Song, has a very, very specific rhythm. And it's either 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, or it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. So visually on the page, it looks as though it's in a cage. Right? So I'm just going to read the first 4 lines of this so that you can get some idea of how the rhythm works. Okay, so this famous Chinese poem by Du Fu. 国破山河在，城春草木深，感时花溅泪，恨别鸟惊现. So there's a very rigid rhythmic structure to it. But each individual character is so difficult to actually define its precise meaning. That's what made me think that there's some connection with quantum mechanics, because the most basic idea of quantum physics is the uncertainty principle, where basically when you get to a small enough scale, you can never know the exact position and time of the existence of any particle, and that's encapsulated in Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And so you've got the idea of this uncertainty, but captured within a very rigid framework, both in Chinese poetry and in the mathematics of quantum physics. So this is a page out of my undergraduate book. So that is how Heisenberg expresses his ideas of uncertainty. It's within a very rigid mathematical framework, which to me looks quite like a Chinese poem because it's an array. This one happens to be 5 across and 4 down, which is just what the poem was. So of course, you can say, well, that's just, such a leap. How could anyone really claim there's any connection between it? Of course, it is a big leap. It's not meant to be taken totally seriously, but there is something to it, because the greatest achievement of quantum physics is something called the standard theory of particles, which was developed in the 1960s by someone working in California called Professor Gell-Mann. And he proposed that the entire universe, all the particles that have mass in the universe, are just composed of 6 subparticles, which he called quarks. And he then chose, so he came up with a theory that can explain every observable type of particle in the universe, just being composed of combinations of either 2 or 3 of these subparticles called quarks. And he called them up, down, strangeness, charm, beauty, and truth. And that struck me as being a very good way of describing genres of poetry or subjects that are dealt with in poetry, where up is euphoria, down is grief, strangeness is fear or perhaps disgust, charm is the relationship between human being to human being, beauty is the relationship between human being and nature, and truth is just the universal truth of the shape of a human life. So that's how I've tried to categorize these poems. And I know it probably sounds very hokey, but it is strange that these physicists who live through equations were choosing this particular kind of language. He didn't need to call his theory the Eightfold Way, which he did, which is a Buddhist tradition. He didn't need to call these quarks strangeness, charm, and beauty. And it extends beyond that. So Stephen Hawking, probably the most famous physicist of the last century, spent his life working on gravity. And he said that if he could unify the force of gravity with the other 3 basic forces in nature, he would know the mind of God. So he chose those words. So I think not only the poets, but also the physicists looking for something behind the reality that they can pin down in their language and their maths. So what I'd like to do now is to read a few of the poems in these categories. So the first one that I'm going to do is a poem in the charm category. So that's relationship between human being to human being. This is a poem by Du Fu, who was writing in the 700s. And his life was sort of split apart. In the early time of his life, he had a relatively peaceful time, but then the empire was split apart by a rebellion. And he spent the rest of his life basically traveling. So there's a kind of sort of anguished, wandering tone to his later poetry. This is an earlier one. And this one just talks about the joys of regaining friendships. So I'm going to read this one in English, the translation. It's called Wei, for Wei, my secluded friend who seeks no office. And it was written in about 765. 2 paths in life might never intertwine, like morning and evening stars. Tonight, then, is a rare event, together you and I in the candlelight. We were young and lusty not so long ago, now grown grey at the temples. We inquire of old friends, find half a ghosts. That shocks us and turns in our guts like grief. How could we have known it'd be 20 long years till I'd visit your home once again? When I left, you were single. Now these boys and girls in a row congenially honour their father's old friend, inquire from whence I've travelled. We talk for a while and then they serve your finest wine with spring chives cut in the night rain, a bowl of freshly cooked sorghum. My host complains it's so hard to meet and urges me to take a 10th cup. But who cares about 10 cups of drunkenness when old feelings remain here unchanged? Tomorrow the mountains will separate us, our cares borne away by the winds. So that's Du Fu writing about friendship. Next one I'd like to read is Down, and it's about grief, another very basic human emotion. And this one is written by Su Dongpo. So Su Dongpo came from a reasonably well-educated family, and he was described even at the time as a genius. And he rose right up to the top of the government structure as a scholar official, but he was too outspoken. So he was banished and he was sent to a very poor area and lived there in some poverty. And during that time, his son died. And he has written this poem about the death of his son. And I'll read it first, and then I'm going to go back and analyze it just briefly. So this poem, the title of this poem is very long, but the title of the poem is Two Poems of Tears Written After the Death of My Son, named Dun and nicknamed Gan, born last year in Huangzhou on the 12th of September, 1083, and imposingly unique until he died of illness in Jingling this year on 31st of August, 1084, aged 1. So this is Su Dongpo writing in 1084. In my 49th year, whilst travelling, I lost an infant. That infant was indeed my son. His brow was already like mine. Not 1 year old, I watched him with such delight, tottering towards my books of histories and poems. He'd shake his head, refusing pears and chestnuts, as if he thought he wasn't worthy. He gave me such a vital joy, I relied on him for all my daily laughter. Suddenly he was torn from us. I blame my sins for this catastrophe. So small, his firewood shroud refutes all natural law. Snuffed out he is, and that's the end of it. I return home to find but an empty embrace. My tears are like the shits, ungovernable. These tears of mine must be wiped away endlessly. The time is far off when I'll forget this terrible day. I cannot bear to hear his mother's sobs. Why could we not have died with you? Your little clothes still hang on your rack. Your milk still lies on the bed. In such anguish, we forget our own lives, lying all day prostrate, insensible. I'm too old to understand what has happened, but foresaw it all in a dream. Medicine heaped high as mountains, yet we found no effective prescription. I'll take a sword forged from this thwarted love and cut up my guts from the waist. I'm lost, but I must come to my senses, though this wound will grieve me forever. So I think it's very powerful, and it's quite interesting because Shakespeare also uses the image of the clothes of a child that has been lost. So Shakespeare used the same image as these empty clothes in his play King John, where the Queen says of her departed son, grief fills the room up of my absent child, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form, then have I reason to be fond of grief. So Shakespeare was using the same analogy. When I was translating that poem, I found it actually in English and then searched for the Chinese, and I searched and I found the part that had been translated, but there's something that I felt was wrong about this poem because Su Dongpo is so sensitive, and yet he hadn't mentioned his wife, the mother of the child. I mean, what was she feeling? So I searched and searched, and finally I found that there's another verse to the poem, which I don't believe has ever been translated to English before. And there's this line, which was so important to me. Mu ku bu ke wen. So mu, mother, ku, tear or cry, which is very pictographic, two eyes with the nose and the mouth and the tear. Yeah. So it's mu ku bu ke wen. which is his mother's sobs are unbearable, or possibly his mother's sobs are inaudible, maybe because she's smothering him in a pillow. But it was quite a relief for me to know that Su Dongpo was actually thinking about the mother as well, rather than just his own grief. Next, I'd like to talk about beauty, which is relationship between man and nature. So this is by Bai Juyi. So Bai Juyi was similar in a sense. He was earlier than Su Dongpo. He lived from 772 to 846, so mid-Tang. And he was similar in the sense that he was a brilliant man. He came from a poor but well-educated family. He never forgot the poverty. And he rose up very high as well. And again, because of his outspoken honesty, he was also exiled. So he was sent to govern a very small region in Sichuan. And the way that he soothed his pain of being basically disenfranchised from everything he had was to build a garden. So this is called Planting Flowers on the Eastern Embankment. And it's written probably about 825, something like that. So it goes, I took money to buy flowering trees, planting them out to the east. I simply bought whatever had blooms, not caring if peach or plum. 100 fruits all mixed together, 1,000 branches flowering in due rotation. Each has its season, early or late. To all alike, the fertile soil is kind. Red ones hang like a heavy mist. White ones gleam like the snow. Wandering bees cannot bear to leave them. Fine birds come here to roost. In front flows an endless stream. Below, the terrace is flat. At times I sweep its flagstones. At others I raise my cup. Branches shade my weary head whilst buds drop down to my lap. Alone I toast my fortune. Alone I chant my verse, unaware of the moon in the west. These Sichuan folk care not for flowers. In springtime nobody came, but I, their drunken governor, will stay here long after dusk. So it's just the consolation of a garden in times of need. So I'm going to finish with 3 short poems, which I put into the truth section. So the first one's about regret. And then the second one is about the passage of time. And the third one is Du Fu, who's worrying about whether any of his works are meaningful, whether his life has any meaning at all. And it's just so ironic that, 1,300 years later, people still love and read his poems. So he was worried at the time that his life had no meaning. So the first one is by Li Yu. So Li Yu was late Tang, and he was actually an unusual person because he was a king, but he was a completely incompetent ruler. So his kingdom was overthrown. He was actually put to death by poisoning by the first Sung emperor in 978. But again, I think he has quite an exquisite appreciation of sort of regret in life. So this is called The Washerwoman's Lament. It's quite short. Deep in the courtyard, all is still. The hall is empty now. When she beats her clothes on the ancient block, the wind gusts cold around. Night wears on, yet no one yet can sleep, as moonbeams mix with voices at the curtained window above. Dishevelled cloud-like hair, her nightdress hangs undone. Eyebrows arch like the far-off hills, cheeks slant as she leans on her hand. She broods on distant memories, still tender as shoots in the spring. For whom does she know these tears as she leans on the balustrade? So the next one is by Wang Anshi, who was the Song Dynasty Chancellor I mentioned before. He lived from 1021 to 1086. And here he is, ill towards the end of his life, quite grumpy, stuck in bed and not feeling great. So this is called Newly Cut Flowers. It's not much fun in later years, stuck in bed and sick. I pour some waters, arrange the flowers, eased by their drifting scents. Scents adrift, yet rooted for that fleeting moment. I wonder how long I can last. Fresh cut flowers and my long lost self, both so soon forgotten. So the last one is by Du Fu, towards the end of his life, during his wandering phase. And here he is, arguably the greatest poet that China ever produced. wondering about whether he actually means anything. So this is called A Record of Feelings from a Night of Travel. The faintest wind bends the shoreline grass. My jutting mast soars lone in the night. Stars hang high across the boundless wilds. Moonlight streams and the great river flows. Have my opponents not given me a name in the world, though I retired as I should now I'm old? Floating, floating like what? I don't know. My whole life just bird tracks on sand. So I'll leave it there. But if anybody has any questions or comments, then I'd love to hear them.
Thank you so much, Tim, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you. It's a very unique experience. Where you read all the poems, it allowed me to stay on each character for longer. And then while I listened to the translation, it almost applied to a new meaning that I never thought of, and it almost comes give me a sort of an enlightenment experience. Like, oh, yeah, that's what it means. It's very beautiful. It's,
one of my Chinese friends once said to me, it was a really interesting comment, because you can get the feeling, but not really, you can't be certain that the actual words and the syntax are right. So there's a friend of mine in China said something that was really interesting that I don't think a foreigner would ever say. And she said that, you know, Du Fu hasn't got any further right to really know what it means other than a reader, you know, so even the people who are writing it, they're just kind of writing these things that can't really be defined, which I thought was a very intriguing idea.
Yes, absolutely. Did you translate all these 70 poems all by yourself? How
Yes.
long did it take? Like, did you encounter any challenges?
So I did it in a real flurry, actually. So basically what I did was I translated, I looked at 1,000, because there are lots that are just too obscure, or say they have an allusion to an event or a place in in China that a foreign wouldn't know, say Hongyan, something like that, or some event. So I avoided all those. So I looked at lots and lots, and then I translated about 70, and it took me about 6 or 7 weeks. But then to polish it, to try and get it into the stage where it had something of the rhythm and something of the underlying meaning. So occasionally I deliberately mistranslated things. So I admit that, you know, I know what the original means, but I mistranslated because I thought what they're really trying to do is something slightly different if it was in English. That took me about 18 months. So a long time. I went back to individual lines again and again and again over a period of 6 months. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite line at all?
Yeah, but it's one that I deliberately mistranslated. So it's the last one that I read. It's Tian Di Yi Shao. Yeah, which literally is sky, earth, one gull. So it's a lone gull between heaven and earth. Okay. Yes. So I mistranslated it. I mistranslated my whole life as bird tracks on sand. So the reason I did that is because it's shao, so it's sand gull. So you've got sand in the Chinese. And I'm sure you know that, you know, very often in literary allusions in Chinese, you use bird tracks on the edge of the sea, and the wave comes in and it goes out again to try and symbolize, you know, the fact that we're only here for a very short length of time, and, you know, you can do whatever you want, but time just wipes it clean. And that's also in English as well. So like there's poems in English like Ozymandias by Shelley, where he uses sand to try and illustrate the infinite. So that's the reason why I sort of mistranslated that.
That's wonderful. I found it very, very beautiful. I think we got some questions from our audience as well.
Great. Yeah, sure.
Why Lee is asking Tim, what's the painting in the background?
Oh, that's Ren Xima, and it's by Zhang Fu, and it's one of my favorites. So it's Yuan Chao, yeah, and you can see here that's Qianlong. So the Qianlong emperor afterwards came along and put his mark on it. So it's actually very, very long because it's got all the colophons, but I just like the colors.
I noticed that you do have a very strong passion for Chinese arts. You also mentioned the famous 清明上河图 in your book.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, thank you for liking the talk. I wonder if everyone would like to, if you would like to share your favorite verses, feel free to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Then I can learn something new.
Actually, I was thinking of a little interaction with our audience.
Yeah, sure.
Just to address the challenges in learning Chinese.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know that little short story of the history of eating lions.
Yes.
I wonder if any of our Chinese audience here would like to volunteer to read a few sentences, just to see how it sounds like.
Yeah.
I will let you, can you share your screen again? You can, and then go to that slide.
Yeah, I'll try.
Can anyone volunteer? And also, I don't know if all the English speakers here know that actually it's Mandarin is a relatively easy language because it only has 4 tones. I know that there are people here from Hong Kong, and Cantonese has like 7 tones or 7 to 9 tones.
Much more difficult, yeah.
Yeah, so actually when I learned Cantonese myself, the word we used to learn about the tones was this word, which is the shi word. So we use that word to try to hear all the 7 tones. I wonder if anyone who speaks Mandarin or Cantonese can maybe read the first sentence of that, of what's on the slide. Yanhua, would you like to try? You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's a big challenge. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe
first 3 sentences until 是是是是是.
Right. Okay. I think because I just quickly review it. I probably can start from the beginning. See, I don't know.
Yeah. How about this? You read one, like you read one sentence, then I will translate like roughly what it means, so that our English speakers can get an idea of what it does actually carry a meaning. Otherwise, all they hear is a shi. Yeah. Okay.
So I'm starting from the title until the shi shi. Is all right?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Okay. Let's start. Shi 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 shi.
So it means the history of a name of a man surnamed Shi eating lions.
Shi 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 shi.
So a poet surnamed Shi coming from a stone room.
Si shi.
He loves lions.
Shi 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 shi.
And he swears he will eat 10 lions. That's basically what it means. That's actually quite a lot of meanings carried, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, why don't we do another sentence?
Okay, cool. Shi 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 shi.
So the man surnamed Shi often goes to the market to look at the lions or looks at the lions from time to time. Yeah. Okay, that's it. So you get the gist of it. So basically it goes about the story of eating lions.
Okay, so you want to start now? Or
thank you so much, Yanhua, for this interaction with us.
Don't worry, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. And I have got a question here from Xiao Chang. Hi, Tim. I want to know if you think the translation of Chinese poems is turning something indefinite to something definite.
Right.
A very philosophical question.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and I think it probably is. That's a fundamental problem, because you can't get the inexpressibility of it into English, because English by its very nature is more specific because it's not a pictogram. So, you know, you can look at those things that are on the screen now, and they can mean slightly different things to different people because it's a picture. So there's an interaction. So yeah, it's just, I think that's a very good question. It's a very good question. It actually also pertains to quantum physics as well, because if you take a measurement of something to try and define it, what it actually is, so if you try and define it, you interact with this tiny particle in quantum physics to measure it, that by nature changes it. So then after you've measured it, you don't know where it is. So you can never measure something. So it's actually a very good question.
It's a bit like a Schrodinger's cat, or
yes, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, he said, oh, we have someone, Wiley is asking, do you mind to show the slide of 火箭黄河水 again?
Yeah.
And oh. So, sorry, why? What do you? What's your question about this slide? Oh, you just want to see it. I think maybe he's trying to. He wanted to see if you can read it.
Can you hear me? Sorry, can you hear me, Tim?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry about wearing the mask because this is the 5,000 Hong Kong dollar fine.
All right. Yeah. You best not take it off. Keep it off.
Yeah, because I'm in the public place. So, but anyway, just very quickly, is this by Huang Tingjian?
Yes.
Tim, is this by Huang Tingjian?
Yes.
Ah, I see. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was not very. It was very quick, so I didn't catch up very.
Sorry. Yeah, it's Huang Tingjian, who's probably my favorite calligrapher, because it's very strong. And
yes,
he was writing about the same time as that page out of the Doomsday Book. So that was probably about 1080, something like that.
That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's really inspirational. Well, I just have a very quick thinking that shall we have any? I mean, can you be found on Facebook, or do you have any channel that we could reach you? I know
we could set up a WeChat group or WhatsApp or something. I'm very
happy. That will be great. That will be great.
Yeah, if Vivian does that, I'm very happy to do that and share things with everybody. Yeah.
And I'm sure you can find lots of Tim's interviews on the mainstream media with CGTN, for example, on YouTube, and then many very inspiring talks. And another very good way to communicate with the author is obviously to read his book. He has published a couple of books, like we said. The newest one is the Cloud Chamber, and also he had another book called Mr. China, which is really worth a read.
Thank you.
Great, great. Thank you.
Mark wanted to know if Tim knows any poems about temples and sacred sites.
There's a wonderful poem about temples. Can I read it?
Yes, of course.
Let me just find it. Sorry, it's okay. So this is Mei Yao Chen. Mei Yao Chen is the most amazing poet, because he just wrote about really sort of ordinary, sometimes quite disgusting things, actually. And he was also I think he was a Jinshi scholar, so he was again quite senior bureaucrat and intellectual. So anyway, this is called The Lone Raptor on the Temple of Universal Purity. And it's medium length, so I'll do it quickly. Yeah. I can see the pavilion. I can see the temple pavilion from my newly rented shack. Its blue and gold reflect on the crumbling walls around. Turtle doves and pigeons gather high up on the towering roof, nesting, perching, feeding. They forget the year has an end. Carved eaves, painted walls, but shit splattered everywhere, excuse me, even on the heads of the Buddha statues below. Yet the monks dare not fire their crossbow darts. Suddenly, an ash-grey raptor spreads its cruel and terrible claws. Crows shriek, the magpies cry, a minor bird squawks and squeals, whilst on high the fearsome executioner hovers, peeking at fresh meat, sniffing the scent of death. It measures, it decides, outnumbered, yet it fears no gathering crowd. Then in a flash, the first brain case smashed to pap. Terror runs through the flock from end to end. Corpse plummets through the wind but never hits the ground. Pivoting on a wing, the falcon grabs it in midair. It settles alone on the roof, tears open ribs with relish, gulps down hunks, slashes up the liver, spits the intestines away. Scavengers, artless and timid, circle resentfully above, desperate to get close, eyes staring hungrily down. They cower as the glutted killer once more takes to wing. Then in a frenzy, they tear at the remains, no telling each bird apart. Urchins point up and gawp. Passers on the road just laugh. And I keep chanting the same old songs on the bank of the autumn stream. So it's a bit about a temple.
Thank you. That's a beautiful translation. Tim, you lived in China for really long, right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I lived in China for, well, I mean, I actually physically lived in China all the time for about 15, 16 years, but before and after I was there most of my time. So I sort of stopped being there most of my time about 8 years ago. And of course, I haven't been able to go for 3 years.
So can I ask you what sent you to study cloud chamber, from studying cloud chamber to studying Chinese poetry? What motivated you?
So basically what happened was that I had an opportunity to go and work in Asia in 1987. And so I chose Hong Kong. At the moment I arrived, before I was even out of the aircraft, I was just totally struck by the written word. It's just so different. Because I can't explain why, but everywhere I saw a character, I wanted to know what it meant. So I actually started studying Chinese I knew nothing about China at all. I hardly even knew who Chairman Mao was. Yeah, I knew nothing about China at all. Never really met Chinese people, occasionally had Chinese food, not very much. So I went to Hong Kong and then I got more and more interested in it. So I signed up for a Mandarin class, which was part-time, which you can't learn that much, but you know, I tried. And I went to Guangzhou about 3 weeks after I arrived, and I was absolutely amazed by Guangzhou then, because it was completely Lao Guoying Qi. Yeah, so it's just totally different. It felt like, you know, you went up the Pearl River by 20 miles and you went backwards in time 50 years. Yeah, so, and I was absolutely just fascinated by it. So then I took time off in 1988 to travel back through China. So I went through, I actually flew to Pakistan. I went over Karakoram into Xinjiang, and then through Gansu and down to Sichuan, and then across the coast, and then right the way back through Russia overland. So it's the contrast between China and Russia that really struck me, because when I got back to the UK, all the newspapers are full of perestroika and glasnost and how great everything is in Russia. I thought that's the wrong way round. China's like light years ahead, and they're much more energetic. You know, even in the late 80s, far more energetic. So anyway, so that's when I said, right, I want to commit to this, and I want to try and learn Chinese. So when I started learning Chinese, I was 29. It's quite late, but well worth it.
I really enjoyed in the book how you talked about all the challenges you face, like how you try to communicate on something,
right.
or you have to say things that you don't actually mean.
Yeah.
You know, you have to use an indirect way to communicate. Right. All these
like 明天再说
means never talk about it.
我永远不会谈那个事情。
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you everyone. Oh wow, I know that Y has posted another poem here by Li Qingzhao, and Li Qingzao, I believe is the only woman.
Yeah, I should have done Li Qingzhao. Actually, that is a very good point. I should have done Li Qingzhao for all sorts of reasons. That I have done. There is Li Qingzhao in the book, but I should have done that in the talk as well. Good point. Good point.
Yeah. And I believe she's the only woman you mentioned. Like you also had a note saying lots of female poets at the time, but not so many were actually recorded.
Well, they probably were recorded, and then their work may have been destroyed by jealous men whose work wasn't as good as the women's.
What a shame.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much everyone for coming, and the time is almost up. I will be sending the link to buy the book to you after the event, and thank you so much, Tim, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And I hope everyone can go home now and enjoy more Chinese poetry. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.